good to have you back. This will be our third and final lecture on Aristotle's conception of the good life in the Nicomachean Ethics. In our last two lectures, we've been really laying the foundation for the detailed discussion of the good life. We've talked about the components of happiness in Aristotle's view. We began with the very famous function argument that started with the hierarchy argument, in which Aristotle argued that there's got to be a hierarchy of ends, there has to be a highest good. We argued that politics was the domain, dismissed a number of alternative views, and launched into the function argument proper. At the end of our last lecture, we concluded that happiness is indeed the highest good as a conclusion of the function argument that arrived at this conclusion by this careful argument that human beings indeed have a function, and that the good life is the life lived in accordance with the excellences appropriate to human beings. Hence the account of eudaimonia, of flourishing, as activity in accordance with virtue. The important thing to remember at the end of our last lecture, we saw that virtue is insufficient for a good life. Activity in accordance with virtue is necessary, and that virtuous activity, Aristotle argues, is actually a pleasant thing for virtuous people. But if happiness is activity in accordance with virtue, we have two big questions to ask. We need to know A, what virtue is, and B, how you act in accordance with it. So in the present lecture, we're going to begin with a discussion of the nature of virtue. We are then going to talk about the dimensions of activity, beginning with practical wisdom, or phronesis, moral strength, or krate, and then the social context in which action is possible. For Aristotle, all of these are dimensions of happiness. We need to have virtue, practical wisdom, moral strength, and a social context. None of them is sufficient to be happy, but when we have all of them, we have this final self-sufficient state of happiness, or eudaimonia. Moreover, each one of these is understood in a very special Aristotelian sense. Just as the word happiness means something very specific in this context, means eudaimonia, virtue is going to mean something very specific. Practical wisdom will mean something very specific. Moral strength will mean something very specific, as will friendship. So let's begin by talking about virtue itself. Aristotle begins by arguing that virtue is something that we acquire by habit. There's a nice lexical point here. The word habit in Greek is actually ethike, the word that we get ethics from. And so when Aristotle's connecting virtue and habit, he's pointing out that virtue, or goodness, ethics, is acquired by habituation. And he offers several main arguments for it. The first is what we'll call the change argument. The second is the acquisition argument. And the third is the same causes argument. The change argument goes roughly like this. If a thing has a capacity by nature, you can't change that capacity by practice. The example that Aristotle gives is the capacity of a stone to fall to the earth. No matter how many times you throw a stone up in the air, you can't habituate it to rising, because falling to the earth is part of its nature, Aristotle points out. You can't possibly habituate it. But virtues can be acquired. You can start out with a little kid who doesn't have an excellence, and by training and good upbringing, make that child virtuous. So virtues aren't natural, but they're acquired by habituation, this notion of ethikos. The second argument is the acquisition argument. For natural qualities, Aristotle points out, we first have the capacity, and then we have the activity that corresponds with the capacity. The example that Aristotle gives is perception. We first have the capacity to see by having functioning eyes, and then we see. We first have the capacity to hear, and then we hear. We could also use the example of our heartbeat. We first have a functioning heart, and then it's able to beat at appropriate rates. It's not that our heart learns to function by beating first. But for things that are acquired, Aristotle argues, we practice first and then develop the capacity. For instance, he points out, it's by practicing building houses that we become good builders. It's by practicing playing music that we become musicians. It's by practice riding horses that we become good equestrians. And Aristotle points out, virtue is like the latter, not like the former. We practice virtuous actions in order to become virtuous. So for all of these reasons, we have the conclusion that virtue is acquired by habituation, not by nature. Finally, we have this kind of same causes argument. This is a kind of fun argument. Aristotle points out that it's a characteristic of things like arts and athletic performance, that the same kind of thing that produces excellence in the domain can also destroy it. If you practice building really sloppy, shoddy houses, you're going to become a really bad carpenter. And if you practice building houses carefully and well, you'll become a good carpenter. If you practice music badly, if you miss your steps on your scales, or if you use bad technique, you'll become a bad musician out of practice. But if you practice music well, paying attention to technique, paying attention to your scales, you'll become a good musician. And these require instruction. It's the same with moral virtue. We acquire it by careful training, and if we behave well, we become good people. If we get habituated to behaving badly, we become bad people, and it can be ruined by bad training. So for all of these reasons, Aristotle argues, virtue is a matter of habit and habituation, not a matter of our natures. I want to read Aristotle's point on this. In one word, states of character arise out of like activities. This is why the activities we exhibit must be of a certain kind. It's because the states of character correspond to the differences between these. Then he emphasizes, it makes no small difference then whether we form habits of one kind or of another from our very youth. It makes a very great difference, or rather, all the difference. For Aristotle, therefore, child rearing is of the absolute essence in bringing up people who are going to be virtuous, who are going to be happy, who are going to be good citizens. The next question, now that we know that virtue is something that's acquired by habituation, is what's the relationship between, how do we tell that somebody's virtuous? That is, what's the relationship between virtue, pleasure, and pain? What's the difference between merely acting virtuously and being virtuous? This is the solution to a kind of chicken and egg problem that arose from the point about acquisition a moment ago. If we become virtuous by performing virtuous actions, how do we perform the virtuous actions? Aren't we already virtuous in that case? Aristotle argues that pleasure and pain is the real test here. You can tell that somebody has a virtue because they take pleasure in acting virtuously. Somebody who doesn't finds the virtuous actions that they end up performing painful. And so Aristotle puts the point this way: we must take as a sign of states of character the pleasure or pain that supervenes upon acts. For the man who abstains from bodily pleasures and delights in this very fact is temperate, that is self-controlled. He who stands his ground against things that are terrible and delights in this, or at least is not pained, is brave, while the man who is pained is a coward. For moral excellence is concerned with pleasures and pains. It is on account of the pleasure that we do bad things, and on account of the pain that we abstain from noble ones. Hence, we ought to have been brought up in a particular way from our very youth, as Plato says, so as both to delight in and to be pained by the things that we ought, for this is the right education. So the point is this: even though people may be performing virtuous actions before they fully acquire virtues, say as apprentice adults, it's not always fun to do so, and they might chafe. But you can tell that somebody's virtuous when they perform the action and take pleasure in doing so. And so now more on the chicken and egg problem. Aristotle raises it explicitly. The question might be asked what we mean by saying that we must become just by doing just acts, and temperate by doing temperate acts. If men do just and temperate acts, they are already just and temperate, exactly as, if they do what is in accordance with the laws of grammar and of music, they are grammarians and musicians. So Aristotle here is emphasizing this chicken and egg problem. If we become just by performing just acts, become temperate by performing temperate acts, how do we perform these acts in the first place? Well, here's what he says. He asks the question, or is this not true even of the arts? It's possible to do something that is in accordance with the laws of grammar, whether by chance or under the guidance of another. A man will be a grammarian then only when he has both done something grammatical and done it grammatically. And this means doing it in accordance with the grammatical knowledge in himself. The distinction that Aristotle is drawing here is doing an act which happens to be in accordance with the rules and internalizing those rules and following them. So we can conclude, if acts that are in accordance with the virtues have themselves a certain character, it does not follow that they are done justly or temperately. So just because somebody is acting right, it doesn't mean they're doing it in the right way. The agent must also be in a certain condition when he does them. In the first place, he must have knowledge. Secondly, he must choose the acts and choose them for their own sakes. And thirdly, his action must proceed from a firm and unchangeable character. So the point Aristotle is making is a very straightforward one here. That is, that it's one thing to perform the occasional just or unjust, for that matter, or brave or temperate act. It's another thing to have developed a character that makes these actions the kind that one spontaneously produces and in which one takes pleasure. So we might say then that you first perform just acts in an unjust way. Maybe you're being instructed by somebody, being told, hand back the book that you borrowed, or maybe you're being coerced, give it back now. And only when one has the virtue of justice do you perform these acts in a just way. This is the distinction between simply performing a virtuous act and being virtuous. But now we need to ask the question, what is a virtue? Well, Aristotle's got a lovely account. He says that a virtue is always a mean between two extreme vices. And the reason for this is that any kind of excellence can be ruined either by excess or by defect. We could have too much of a trait or too little of a trait. That's why Aristotle argues that it's so hard to become a good person, because it's hard to precisely hit the mean. It's hard to find the center of a circle. And for different people, of course, that mean might also be different. Just for instance, as in eating, a professional athlete may need to eat a lot of food, whereas somebody on a diet very little. So achieving a virtue, Aristotle argues, is a kind of art that requires judgment and expertise. You remember he pointed that out in saying that a young person is not a person to study ethics. And so Aristotle offers a number of examples of virtues and the pairs of vices that correspond to them. We might say that courage is a mean between cowardice, having too little of the trait, and rashness, having too much. Being rash is no virtue. It's running into danger thoughtlessly. The courageous person faces danger thoughtfully and appropriately. Generosity is a mean between stinginess and profligacy. Dignity is a mean between self-deprecation and pomposity. It's a bad thing to think too little of yourself, a bad thing to think too much. Dignity is somewhere in between. Wittiness, a nice virtue to display at a dinner party, is a mean between boorishness and buffoonery. And we certainly know people who fail to hit that mean and land in each extreme. Friendliness, a mean between grouchiness and promiscuity. And honesty, a mean between dishonesty and tactlessness. So you're not being honest when somebody asks, how does this dress look on me? And you say, it looks absolutely frightful, you look disgusting. Even if that's the truth. That's just tactless. That's too much of a good thing. And so Aristotle concludes from this point that virtue is always this mean between extremes. Hence, it is no easy task to be good, for in everything it's no easy task to find the middle. For example, to find the middle of a circle is not for everyone, but for him who knows. So too can anyone get angry. That is easy. Or give or spend money. But to do this to the right person, to the right extent, at the right time, with the right motive, and in the right way, that is not for everyone, nor is it easy. Wherefore goodness is both rare and laudable and noble. This is a really lovely and deep point. If you want to know why it's so hard to find truly good people, the answer is because it involves this judicious ability to hit the mean. So much for virtue. As we said before, virtue needs to be supplanted with an account of activity in accordance with virtue, and activity requires choice, and choice requires wisdom. So virtue isn't anywhere near enough for happiness. Choice isn't just a wish. It's not that I perform an action just by wishing that I could. In order to choose an action, I need to deliberate. We might wish for our ends. I might wish to become wealthy. I might wish to become a great teacher. I might wish to be a better philosopher or to learn Serbo-Croatian. But I have to deliberate to choose actions. I have to deliberate to figure out how to make money, how to be a better teacher, or how to learn Serbo-Croatian. So wishing mobilizes virtue, but deliberation mobilizes practical wisdom, that is, phronesis. You might wonder, isn't practical wisdom just another virtue? Aristotle argues that it's not. He argues that it's not for two reasons. First, practical wisdom or phronesis is not a mean. That is, you can't have too much of it, the more the better, and that's not true of the traits that become virtues. And secondly, practical wisdom can serve vice as well. The thief may have good practical wisdom. He may know how to crack safes, how to pick your pocket. So practical wisdom is an independent dimension from virtue and vice. It's not sufficient to have practical wisdom in order to be happy, but it is necessary, because if you only have virtue and don't know how to choose actions, then you'll be, unfortunately, the person who's good at heart, but who screws her life up in all kinds of ways. Practical wisdom keeps you from messing up, as it were. As we said in our very first lecture on Aristotle, just having virtue and practical wisdom isn't enough either. There's a third dimension, and that's the dimension of moral strength. Because it's possible to want to do what's right and to work out using your practical wisdom exactly what the right thing is, and to fail to do it because of temptation or because of an inability to face pain. We call this moral weakness. But it's also, of course, possible, and we know people like this, to stick to one's resolve even if it's difficult. That's what we call moral strength. Moral strength is not a matter of having virtue, and moral weakness is not a matter of a lack of virtue. It's instead a lack of fortitude. We can see that moral strength isn't a virtue because there's no mean here, again, just like practical wisdom. You can't have too much of this trait. The more moral strength you have, the better. The other reason is it could be related to vice as well. You could decide to do something really horrible, to commit a murder, to rob a bank. And you might be tempted not to do it, it might be scary, but you call up your moral strength and you stick to your resolve. So moral strength isn't necessarily in the service of the good. So like practical wisdom, it could serve vice or virtue. It's a separate dimension. Moreover, unlike virtue and practical wisdom, moral strength doesn't seem to involve knowledge. Virtue requires us to know what to do. Practical wisdom requires us to know how to do it. But we could have all of that knowledge and still fail to act. And what shows that is the idea of regret. People who are morally weak, even though they don't act virtuously, regret acting viciously. They feel bad. They know what they should have done. They know that they failed. And that also shows that moral weakness is different from vice, because people who are vicious rejoice in their vice. They know what they did. They chose it freely. They did it, and they're pleased. We might be repelled by it, but they think it's okay. But the morally weak person knows that she did wrong, and so regret is a good sign that we're dealing with virtue plus moral weakness when we see a vicious act, not vice. Since action requires virtue, practical wisdom, and moral strength, and since happiness, as we've seen, is activity in accordance with virtue, that is, eudaimonia is activity in accordance with virtue, all three of these, virtue and these two conditions on the action side, practical wisdom and moral strength, are all necessary for the happy life. None of them is individually sufficient. That's good. This covers the internal side of the good life, the sort of aspect of character. We've got virtue, we choose the right ends, we have the right habits, we make the right choices, and we take pleasure in that. We've got practical wisdom, we know how to deliberate and choose actions appropriate to our ends, and we've got moral strength, that is the resolve to stick to those choices. We're halfway there. But we still need the external goods that make eudaimonia, that make flourishing possible. There are two classes of these goods that Aristotle discusses. The first are what we might call material goods. You need to have enough wealth to be generous. You need to have good health in order to act courageously. You need basically the furniture that keeps you from serious want, serious illness, and so forth. And Aristotle concedes that it's possible to have all of the right internal states and yet not have the life one would choose. And we can see this because we might say of somebody, she didn't deserve the life she had. She had all this virtue, all this wisdom, all this moral strength, but these terrible things befell her. That would not be a life of flourishing. That would be a life where the internal side was right, but the external side wasn't. And so Aristotle concedes that to lead a really productive life, material supports are necessary. And sometimes we might fail from no fault of our own to be entirely happy for that reason. But Aristotle also argues that social goods are essential to the happy life. I think this is a very important and very distinctive character of Aristotelian ethics and of the Aristotelian characterization of the good life. Elsewhere, Aristotle argues that human beings are what he calls political animals. Now, by political animals, he doesn't mean that we're always involved in elections and we want to be involved in campaigns and join political parties. He means political in the sense of being essentially members of a polis, essentially members of a state or a society. That we are essentially political. It's not an accident. It's not that human beings are naturally lone wanderers around the savannah and sometimes accidentally we come together and say, let's form a society. No, it's our very nature to live in society. And so that if we're going to have a good life, that life has to be lived with social virtues in the context of a social order. And it's worth noting already that just as we've talked about the virtues themselves, this internal dimension of happiness, they're already social. Generosity involves giving things to others. Courage involves daring to face danger for the benefit of others, and so forth. We already have social virtues on the internal side. But for Aristotle, friendship is absolutely essential to a meaningful life. But again, we want to think about this word friendship, because Aristotle uses friendship, the Greek term philia, in a sense, much broader than that in which we use the word friendship. We tend to think of our friends as people we like to hang out with, people we choose to be with, people who are nice to us or to whom we like to be nice, and so forth. Aristotle uses this term much more in the sense of connectedness. And there are many different kinds of connections. So we might have business associations. For Aristotle, that's a kind of friendship. We might have professional associations. That's a kind of friendship. We might have family associations. That's a kind of friendship. Civic associations, another kind of friendship. Romantic associations, another kind of friendship. So when Aristotle talks about the importance of friendship, he's talking about the importance of human connectedness more broadly. Now let's read Aristotle a little bit on this topic. Aristotle says, "No one would choose to live without friends, even if he had all the other goods. For in fact, rich people and holders of powerful positions, even more than other people, seem to need friends. For how would one benefit from such prosperity if one had no opportunity for beneficence?" Isn't that a wonderful line? Aristotle really thinks that if you're wealthy and if you're powerful, what you need are people for whom to do good. Otherwise, what's the point? So the wealthy and the powerful need friendship. But they need it for another reason too. Aristotle continues, "And how would one guard and protect prosperity without friends?" That's important too, because after all, if you've got goods, people might be out to get you, and you need friends to watch your back. But it's not only the rich who need friends. Aristotle continues in this section, "In poverty also, and in other misfortunes, people think friends are the only refuge." So when life goes bad, we turn to our friends. In illness, we turn to our friends to help us out. In poverty, to lend us money, and so forth. Moreover, the young need it to keep them from error. The old need it to care for them and support the actions that fail because of weakness, and those in their prime need it to do fine actions. So at any stage of life, friendship is important. When we're young, our friends help us cultivate virtue and keep us out of trouble. That is, Aristotle doesn't envision gang members here. When we're elderly and our faculties fail, we need friends to help care for us. And when we're in our prime, if we're actually going to lead lives worth living, many of the actions we perform are collective actions and so require friends. After all, you can't be a great baseball player without a team to play on. You can't be a successful business person without a firm to work in. So many of the actions we perform are not individual actions, but collective actions. So there are all of these benefits of friendship that Aristotle's pointing out. It enhances our abilities because so many of our activities require this kind of cooperation. Friendship also, Aristotle argues, promotes social cohesion. So it holds societies and states together. And we want to live in a collectivity, in a state, in a society that is cohesive, and friendship makes that work. Our mutual commitments give us reason to work for the common good, and so give people reasons to contribute to their society. And moreover, Aristotle argues, it generates just plain goodwill. Now, Aristotle distinguishes three different kinds of friendship based on three bases. He argues that some friendships are based on the good, some are based on pleasant, and some are based on the useful. So these three reasons for friendship, Aristotle argues, give rise to three very different kinds of friendship, which Aristotle characterizes as pleasure friendship, utility friendship, and virtue friendship. So let's look at those three kinds in order. Aristotle says of pleasure friendship, the cause of friendship between young people seems to be pleasure. For their lives are guided by their feelings, and they pursue above all what is pleasant for themselves and what is near at hand. Nothing much has changed since ancient Greece, has it? But as they grow up, what they find pleasant changes too. Hence, they're quick to become friends and quick to stop. So young people's friendships, Aristotle argues, are temporary matters because they're based on whether the friend gives them pleasure or not. Here's another insight that might surprise you. Young people are prone to erotic passion, since this mostly follows from feelings and is caused by pleasure. And that's why they love and quickly stop, often changing in a single day. Remember junior high? These people wish to spend their days together and to live together, for this is how they gain the good things corresponding to their friendship. Pleasure friendship, Aristotle argues, is a thing of youth. It's based on pleasure, and we remain friends so long as the friendships give us pleasure. Now Aristotle considers utility friendship. This sort of friendship seems to arise especially among older people, since at that age they pursue what is advantageous, not what is pleasant, and also among those in their prime or youth who pursue what's expedient. Nor do such people live together very much, for sometimes they don't even find each other pleasant. Hence, they have no further need to meet this way if they are not advantageous to each other. So the kind of friendship Aristotle has in mind here, the kind of association, is a business or a professional association. Our business associates, our professional associates, our clients or our customers are useful to us, but they may not be pleasant to us. So we associate with them as long as they're useful. Now, both of these two kinds of friendship are limited. They're both incidental to particular ends, either the end of pleasure or the end of expediency. As a consequence, both pleasure friendship and utility friendship are temporary matters, and neither really conduces to virtue in any deep sense, though they still contribute to our flourishing. We must not forget that. For instance, consider collegiality. Consider student-teacher relationships, or how we value our club memberships and the people we associate with there, the joy that we get out of our professional associations. Each one of these contributes so to our personal development, each to social cohesion, and each provides arenas for cultivation. But friendship in the full sense, Aristotle argues, is virtue friendship. He says, complete friendship is the friendship of good people similar in virtue, for they wish goods in the same way to each other insofar as they are good, and they are good in themselves. Now those who wish goods to their friends, for the friend's sake, are friends most of all, for they have this attitude because of the friend himself, not coincidentally. Hence, these people's friendship lasts as long as they are good, and virtue is enduring. This kind of deep friendship, Aristotle is arguing, is the friendship that we really value in our lives, and that really make our lives worth living. Aristotle says, these kinds of friendships are likely to be rare, since such people are few. Moreover, they need time to grow accustomed to each other, for as the proverb says, they cannot know each other before they have shared the traditional peck of salt. So Aristotle is arguing here that friendship is an extraordinarily important dimension of our lives. And this special deep virtue friendship is by far the most important. Virtue friendship is characterized by being based upon regard for the other per se, not upon incidental features like how pleasant they are or how useful. It's a friendship between virtuous people that's slow to develop and long-lasting. Virtue friendship isn't an emotion, but it's a standing characteristic like happiness itself, a pervasive part of our being. This is the kind of friendship that makes our lives most meaningful, maintains our virtue and happiness, and gives depth to our lives. So for Aristotle, the happy life is a cultivated life of good habits. It's an active life, a civic life, a thoughtful life, a life characterized by moral strength and good fortune. But above all, it's a social life, characterized by very deep friendships and social commitments. The meaning in our life arises from very careful self-cultivation in a social context and from our deep relationships to others. We've now visited India and classical Greece, and we've seen accounts of life made meaningful through understanding and cultivation. We've seen accounts according to which happiness is attainable through our own actions. I hope these sound familiar to you. We believe a lot of this. But we're now, in our next lecture, going to turn to the Hebraic tradition, to the foundations of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. You might think that that's a place that should seem like home, but you might find it surprisingly foreign. Happiness may not be so much in the cards, and our agency may not matter all that much.